Good Friday morning, everyone. Constance tells me that I look very harmless this morning. Well, let's just see about that. Well, anyway, we're still talking about the Pantacle, and hopefully we're talking about your Pantacle. And I'm only giving you an example of my Pantacle as a springboard for discussion. And I promised you yesterday that I would show, or at least discuss, how my Pantacle, where I stand, my view of the magical world that I live and move and work in, is based on this design, or at least illustrated at the moment by this design. And it's really cool looking. I know it's really cool looking, but it really means something to me. And I created it back in 1976 at the conclusion of my OTO first degree initiation. And I submitted the essay describing the inner workings and the method to my madness, the reasoning behind the illustration, just sort of voluntarily as my my first degree essay, okay? And I've read the whole thing to you in an earlier broadcast. Years later, as I experienced, I won't say I taught a Monday night magic class, because Monday night magic class taught me. But I started a project whereby I eventually created, and Constance helped me created and designed, and then Constance helped with a beautiful paint job and helped me write the booklet that went with it, a deck of tarot cards. And I could easily see how my Pantacle was the basis for my tarot deck. Indeed, it's the basis for every Kabbalistically constructed tarot deck. And I'm going to briefly show you how before we start talking about the hardcore carpentry work going into making a Pantacle. First of all, there's 4 trees of life, and they're all joined together. They all share a central kether, or number 1. That guy right there in the very middle. There he is. All right. And then the 4 trees of life spring out of that in the same way as there is only one. But in the process of, I guess we would call it evolution from our point of view, but from the Godhead singularity point of view, it's a depressing fall from the purity of oneness. But that one, in order for people to wrap our meat brains around, we had to look at that one in terms of it being 4. And I've gone through it before. 1, we can't say very much about Mr. 1 because, or Ms. 1, because it's just too simple. It's too absolute. What are the qualities of 1? It's unified. It's one. It's one-ish. It's monad-esque. But that's about all you can say. We can think about what one might be like better if we chop it in two and think about it in terms of two, because then we have opposites that we can deal with. Now, two is not as pure as one, but it gives us something to think about: on and off, right and left, up and down, hot and cold, love and hate. But that two isn't really anything in and of itself. We do know one thing, that two isn't the one. And that knowledge that two isn't the one, all of a sudden is number three. So 1, 2, and 3 is just one thinking about itself. It actually starts to pop out into objectiveness when we reach 4. And that's where the Kabbalist said, stop. 4 is going to be the God that we can wrap our meat brains around. And there we have our Yod He Vav He. There we've got Jehovah. There we've got Jove, Jupiter, number 4 on the tree of life. Jove, Jehovah. Sorry, it's the same thing. The Greeks called it the demiurgos. It's a god that thinks it's God, but it isn't God, because it has no idea that there were 3 really mystical things, 1, 2, and 3, that came before it. All number 4 knows that it popped into objective reality. It popped into space-time and looked around and said, well, I don't see anybody else here, so I must be God. And that's just how Jehovah acts. And that's just how Jove acts. And that's just how Jupiter and Zeus acts. But that's the objective universe we're dealing with. And in a sense, that's what we're going to try to have to understand the whole process by working within this context. Okay, so each of those trees of life that pop out of that singularity are represented in the tarot by the ace and the 9 small cards. Okay, they form a tree of life. So we could say that this is the tree of life, starting this way, of wands. And this is the tree of life of cups. And this is the tree of life of discs. And this is the tree of life of swords. I said that out of order, but that's okay. So, everything else can be chopped up into those 4 trees of life. And so we've got all 40 of those tarot cards represented there. Now we could lump the big parts of each of those trees of life, the Ruach, or excuse me, the Neshama, the Ruach, the Atzilith, and the 4 parts of the soul, the 4 parts of the 4 Kabbalistic worlds. We could lump those sections together in their broad categories. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of the tree of life. Okay. There's a tree of life right there. Okay. Number 1 could be the Hay final, or number 10. And then number 9 through 4 would be the Vav. And number 3 would be the first Hay. and number 2 and 1 would be the yod. And that those broad categories are represented by the court cards, or at least the king, queen, and prince of the court cards. The princess and the ace have a thing going on, and we treat them differently. Be that as it may, all of the lesser arcana are represented absolutely beautifully by the circles that we see in this diagram here, the emanations, all emanating from one. Now, what about the trumps, the 22 trumps? Well, we know that each tree of life, each of the 10 Sephiroth of the tree of life are joined by 22 paths. But are there really 22 times 4? That's a really thick tarot deck. And I'm sure U.S. game systems would just love to sell a tarot deck that and charge for a tarot deck that big. But I'm going to give you a little secret, and it's going to require you to expand your mind for a minute. Let's look at those 4 trees of life for wands, cups, swords, and discs. They each got a card. Not only that, they each got all sorts of spirits that are assigned to them, and demons and angels and Enochian squares and times of dates and decans and everything. They got all sorts of attributes associated with them. And their tree of life is joined by 22 paths. As a matter of fact, their tree of life is joined by the conduits that are the forces and the qualities and the meanings and the significance of the 22 trumps. The same 22 trumps, the same 22 paths are shared by all 4 suits, by all 4 trees of life, by all 4 Kabbalistic worlds, by all 4 parts of the soul simultaneously. Now, you might think that well, that's a chaotic thing. Well, you should have nailed down a meaning for that particular tarot card and that particular path. Well, to a certain extent, you do. But the path of let's say, the magician, the magician's path, or bet, in the tree of life, goes from number 1 to number 3 on a tree of life. But the number 1 of the world of Atzilith, wands, is a different animal than the one of, say, Asaya, the earth, hay, discs. It's, in essence, it's the same, but it's a different quality. And so the conduit that runs between number 1 and number 3 on the tree of life for Atzilith, or the wands, also has to be of a different character, of a different aspect, of a different facet of that particular if you want to look at it electrically, a different resistance that allows a current to flow from 1 to 3 in the world of wands differs from the resistance, the magician card that runs from 1 to 3 in the world of Asaya or the world of discs. Now, I know I'm not saying that, and if I would have sat down and tried to write this out, I know after about 10 hours, I could come up with a nice paragraph that could have probably said that more succinctly. But I thought I'd just, like a fool, pull it off the top of my head this morning. So that being said, that was for the benefit of you making your own design. You know, my first Pentacle was just a yin yang. I did it in candle wax. Did a yin yang. I said, oh, that's going to be that's subtle. And it worked okay to have on my altar and to play around with and everything. And to a certain extent, it is so profoundly cool. But I tell you, young Lon was not profoundly cool enough to see how profoundly cool that was, and it was a total freaking cop-out. You could make your Pentacles design, and maybe the first few ones that you do will be a total cop-out too. Just do it. Get it over with. Actually making a Pentacle, again, from Homemade Magic. I probably should apologize for rambling on and on about the importance of the design for your Pentacle, without offering any practical advice as to how you might go about making the material object itself. Let's change that right now. Here are a few thoughts and suggestions. Using standards set by the Golden Dawn, the Pentacle should be 8 inches in diameter and ½ an inch thick. It should be round, flat, and rather heavy. Round because it should remind you of both the ring of the horizon that surrounds you as you stand on the surface of the earth and the disk of the sun that circles you daily in the heavens. Flat because your work must be built upon a foundation that is level. And heavy because the magician's work must be firmly and substantially grounded and, for the time being at least, fixed in place. If the Pentacle is made of metal, the ideal metal is gold or gold-plated silver. Not many of us today can afford a round slab of pure gold, 8 inches in diameter and ½ an inch thick. So this is not an option for most magicians. Beeswax is also an ideal material for a Pentacle. It's been used for centuries by magicians. Not only is beeswax infinitely more inexpensive than gold, or indeed any metal, but it's very easy, even pleasurable to work with. It smells wonderful too. If cared for properly, it'll last hundreds of years. It's the product of industrious labor and is actually a living substance. Among its many other attributes, the Pentacle represents the magician's livelihood and material sustenance. It's quite literally the food of the magician. When one looks at one's Pentacle, one should feel a visceral urge to take a bite out of it. Like eating the earth, like eating the sun, like eating the body of God. A Pentacle of beeswax fills the bill nicely. Beeswax is easy to obtain if you know where to look. Most farmers markets have at least one honey farmer who also sells blocks of beeswax. It's also found in bulk at hardware stores, where it is used as a bolt and screw lubricant. Food grade, however, is preferable. Candle wax or paraffin is also easy to obtain, and while less desirable from a mystical perspective, is very easy to work with. Paraffin candle stubs are in no short supply at the DuQuette house. For many years, we celebrated the Gnostic Mass in our living room at least once a month. The high altar of the lovely ceremony was illuminated by 22 candles, which we replaced after 2 or 3 usages. I have used recycled Mass candles to make several versions of my personal Pentacle, my Enochian magic sigillum, and assorted other magic discs. Directions for making a homemade wax Pantacle. Please know that I set the house on fire once doing this. I think I'll mention that in a second. 1. Buy or find a round biscuit tin or Christmas cookie tin, approximately 8 inches in diameter. A little more or less will be fine. Clean it thoroughly, then coat the inside with cooking oil, spray, or vegetable oil. You will not be using the lid of the tin. 2. Place your blocks of beeswax, paraffin, or candle stubs inside the container. Estimate and use your own judgment as to how much wax it'll take, so that when melted, the disc will be approximately a ½ inch thick. Place the biscuit tin with wax on a cookie sheet. Making sure none of the blocks of wax or candle stubs leans over the rim of the container, place your tin in a kitchen oven at a very low temperature. Watch the melting every minute. Do not leave the room for a moment. What happened once, dear?
Lon nearly burned the house down. Lon's not allowed to play with fire anymore.
I just left the house for a minute.
No.
We were moving, in the process of moving. Constance was in the garage gathering up stuff to pack up. And as you can imagine, you might imagine that we've got some
interesting stuff in the garage, and Lon came out to see what I was doing. And he completely forgot he had put in a very tall chunk of black wax in a metal cookie tin in the oven on probably high heat. And of course it tipped over and the wax spilled all over the stove. The kitchen caught completely fire. Even turning off the stove didn't stop the blaze. We had to call the fire department. There was smoke in the house where Jean-Paul was watching TV down to about 3 feet above the floor. He was watching TV on the floor, so he didn't even notice it.
Smoke coming down.
Yeah, so it was. We were going to bulldoze the house in a couple of weeks, so it didn't matter much. And the top of the stove still worked after that for a couple of weeks, so it was a miracle. But girls can only play with fire in our house.
I have nothing more to say. Keep checking to make sure the wax is melting and not leaking onto the cookie sheet or the floor of the oven. At the first sign of leaking, remove everything immediately and turn off the oven. I'm being so insistent about safety because I once set fire to the house doing this. It wasn't pretty. Constance is still upset. Be patient. Everything will eventually melt into beautiful liquid wax. Carefully remove the tin from the oven and allow to cool slowly at room temperature. Don't try to hurry the cooling process by placing the tin in the refrigerator or freezer, as you will risk cracking the wax. After the wax is cooled completely to room temperature, at least 4 hours, turn the tin over and gently slam it on the countertop, or the countertop you're allowed to slam things on. If you oil the tin sufficiently, a perfect wax disc will pop out. The bottom will become the perfectly smooth top surface of your disc. Apply your Pantacle's design with a sharp pointed object such as a compass point. Hints for carving your design on the wax disc. And this is where we'll stop right after this little hint. First, draw your design on a sheet of paper. The drawing can be 8 inches in diameter, but you will want to make it several photocopies of it, and the photocopy should be enlarged or reduced to perfectly match the size of your wax disc. When you're ready to begin, cut out your paper drawing of the disc and secure it to the wax disc with several pieces of tape. Yeah, tape actually sticks to the wax harmlessly. I just roll up a piece of regular Scotch tape into like a tube, and it makes like a double-sided piece of tape. Then, using a thin sewing needle, pierce every place on your drawing where a line starts, ends, and intersects with another line. Make sure the perforations go completely through the paper and lightly into the wax. This can take a long time. Be patient and careful. When you are absolutely certain you have marked every landmark on your design, remove the paper and, using your compass point and straight edge, draw your design on the surface of the wax. For lettering, you'll have to more or less eyeball it and do the best you can. If you take your time and are careful, you'll be rewarded with the most beautiful object of art you've ever created, and it'll truly be your magical Pantacle. And do you have anything to add, my dear?
Once we did a Pentacle class during our Monday night class, and I made a temporary one out of, well, I figured the earth isn't much without water and sun, so I made a temporary Pentacle out of a round pan. I made cornbread with sunflower seeds on the top, and that was a nice Pentacle. We all ate it.
It was it was a real Pantacle.
Made out of dirt and sun.
Made out of dirt and sun, and there's nothing more Pantacle-ish than cornmeal. Cornbread. Well, and we enjoyed it very much. And there were sunflower seeds. Yeah. Well, that's it for today. Of course, we've gone over time. Start your weekend early. I know I have. And we'll see you tomorrow for Saturday morning cartoons. Until then, continue to be good to yourself and be good to each other. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law. Love under